Hello, once again here. Welcome back to Libertyman. What we do here is a little unique in what other people might be doing in the country, and that is we look at how current issues are dealt with according to the original intent of the Constitution. We don't put any private interpretation into what we do. And I say we because I'm a member of a team of people. I don't do things solo. If I don't know the answer to something, I know who to call, kind of thing. But our sole purpose is truth. We want the truth to be known, both in the laws of nature and of nature's God. We want to do whatever we can within our power to teach people what the original Constitution really means. And it's not difficult if you know how to look and you know how to study. So I'm going to present a little thing here. The Supreme Court of the United States itself declares, by quoting a scripture of 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 20, that there is no private interpretation. Now, Peter is talking about the scriptures of the Holy Bible, because holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. I'm not saying that, and the courts are not saying that the men that wrote our constitutions were necessarily holy men of God. They were speaking by direct revelation from God. But what the Supreme Court says in quoting that verse when it comes to interpreting, or the word interpretation is real simple. It's defining the terms. That's what interpretation means, is defining the terms. But they quote 2 Peter 1:20 at the end of a book called Stories, Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. That book was written in or published in 1833 by the Supreme Court, primarily authored by Associate Justice Joseph Story, but it was a collaboration with all of them. He starts with Columbus's voyage and goes through the development of all 13 colonies, goes through the revolutionary government and how they handled problems and solved problems. And they declare at the end of that book that there is no private interpretation as to what was just presented. So that's what we endeavor to do here. I'm going to show you the documents. I'm going to show you the actual document. It may not be the original hand, facsimile copy or whatever, but still it's the original documents. And so that you can understand it for yourself. So with that in mind, as much as we try to, we're going to share a screen. And we're going to go to Joseph Story's commentaries, but we're going to focus on the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. Earlier this morning, I ran across a YouTube video by a man named Darius Spearman. He's a professor of Black Studies, whatever that means. I didn't look up what college or university he teaches at, but his video is called How the United States Constitution Made the Civil War Inevitable. He's right in his assumption, and I'm not going to go into all of that today, but one of the things he focused on was the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. And this being Black History Month, and I hear people all the time saying they only considered the slave as 3/5 of a human being. Well, what did they actually say about it? They, meaning the guys that debated the wording of the clauses and the laws. Not what you or I may think today it should have been or what they should have done, because history is what people did. The present is what we do with that information. But what they did is never going to change. It is what it is, or was what it was. And for us to try and put our private interpretation into it is a violation of historical study. Okay, it's basically a perjury or a forgery, because if, let's just use this as an example. We hear about separation of church and state all the time. Separation of church and state, separation. It's constant. It's unconstitutional because of separation of church and state. Well, if you actually read the Constitution itself, it's a little bitty thing you can stick it in your pocket. If you read the whole entire thing or pull it up on your computer and then hit, I have a Mac, and you hit Command F, that's find or search the document, and you search the clause separation of church and state, you'll find that it doesn't exist. So to put that forth as being constitutional is a forgery of the document. You don't like what I just said? Get over it. That's all I can say. If it's not in there, it's not in there. We can't put it in there. But if it is in there, they did, in fact, explain everything about why they did what they did. And they wrote it down so that we would know exactly how to honor our oath of office to protect and defend what they did, so that we can perpetuate what they did from generation to generation. And that's another topic for another day. But I wanted to give you that foundation of why this is so important. I mean, it is volatile today. On the news, we have a whole entire month dedicated to Black history. And just about everybody on one side of the spectrum uses the 3/5 clause as a battering ram against why the founding fathers were evil. So we are going to go to Joseph Story's commentaries on the Constitution. This is from a website called Lonang, Lonang, Laws of Nature and Nature's God. Lonang.org. And so here's the original document itself. Here's Joseph Story's commentaries. And he says here in section 629, the next clause of the second section of the first article respects the apportionment of the representatives among the states. So if you look here, it is the very second paragraph in the Constitution. So this was important. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and with every subsequent term of 10 years in such manner as we shall by law, as they shall by law direct. And then it goes and tells you the number of representatives that were given to each state. I'm going to pause here and explain a little bit of this to you. That's right here. You see this in red? That's the footnote that it comes from. They cite the Federalist Papers a lot. Eliot's Debates is another one. And Eliot's Debates is the debates of the 13 states ratification conventions to ratify the Constitution. They go through the pro and the con of both sides of the argument so that you see how they worked through the problems to come up with the solution. The purpose of this is representation and taxation. How are we going to figure out how many representatives each state is going to have, and how much direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states? You have to remember that these people are coming out of the Articles of Confederation, which worked okay as long as we were at war. It really didn't get established and ratified until after we had actually, or really close to where we had won the war in 1781. But at that point, all the states in the Continental Congress had one vote. Now they could send as many as one, or as little as one, or as many as 7 delegates to the convention. But even with that, each state at that time, because they had declared themselves states in the Declaration of Independence in 76, they only had one vote. So a simple majority of the states chose all the laws of what they were doing. But this Constitutional Convention came out of that Congress. They wanted to get together and amend the Articles of Confederation, as the preamble says, to form a more perfect union. So representatives and direct taxes are to be apportioned among the several states, which may be included in this union. So they're leaving it for future states according to their respective numbers. So they're trying to figure out how to use the numbers to come up with how many representatives the state's going to have, and what is going to be used for direct taxation. And it's going to be determined by the whole number of free persons. Now, what the 1619 Project will tell you, and the Black Lives Matter tell you, is all they say is that the slaves were considered 3/5 of a man, as being not a human being of any value. It has nothing to do with it. But the whole number of free persons. There's always been free blacks from day one. There's always been the first black politician served for over 40 years in New Hampshire, and he was even a judge. That's another story, but they could always vote, they could always hold property, they had all the rights of any other citizen in the nation. So yes, there were free blacks, and there were free blacks that bought themselves out of slavery. There were a lot of slaves that were freed by their owners upon the death of the owner. You know, one man in particular sold all of his slaves and infuriated all of his relatives and descendants, because his whole entire fortune he liquidated. And it was Braxton Carter of Virginia, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, slaveholder in the state of Virginia. And then all of those guys became free members of society and had the right to vote. So if you're free, you're free. It didn't matter if you were Chinese, African, Malaysian, doesn't matter. If you're a free man, you can vote, but you had to be a citizen, including those bound to service for a term of years. Now, we don't understand this. These were people that were called indentured servants. These people were slaves, but they were bound for a term of years. An indentured servant would generally serve 7 years. That goes to the Old Testament with the doulos. And we're not going to get into that, the bond slave. But after a term of 7 years, they would become free men and then have all the rights to citizenship, because they had been living here for a term of 7 years. And excluding Indians not taxed. Well, what about the Indians? Why aren't the Indians representative? Nobody's arguing and fighting. It says here, Indians are completely excluded. No, it doesn't. It says Indians that are not taxed. So what does that mean? Well, it's real simple. Indian tribes, as they do today here in the state of Mississippi, the Choctaw tribe has its own reservation, has its own government, has its own constitution, and yet they still get to vote for their, because of the way things have changed over the years, they still have the right to vote and be taxed, but they do have certain independencies outside of the United States because they're recognized as a nation, the Choctaw Nation, and this lives right here in Mississippi. I've worked for them for quite a few times. But I guess they're considered now a dual citizenship. Anyway, but the reason they're not taxed is because they're in an independent nation. So they have the rights of sovereignty. And that's what they did back here. The tribes still held their sovereignty in many places. Not all of them did. The ones that didn't live on the reservations or was an active member of that tribe, then they would be subject to taxation just like anybody else, and would be able to be considered in the whole number of free persons. Tax-paying citizens, basically what it means. And 3/5 of all other persons. Now, it doesn't just say Negroes, does it? Negroes is Spanish for black. That's all it is. That's just the way we use the term today. It's been bastardized into other things, but using the term Negro is just saying that this is a member of the black African race. People don't consider Egyptians as Africans, and yet they are because they're from the continent of Africa. It's crazy how that works out, but nonetheless, 3/5 of all of the persons. Now, the majority of these other persons were slaves, and yes, they did not quote the word slave here because of other clauses in the Constitution that we're not going to get into today. However, 3/5 of all other persons, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years of the first meeting of the Congress. They were going to do a census at in 1790 would have been the first census to get an exact count. But I will tell you this, at this time, this point in time, there was about 3 million people, which is about the same amount of people in the state of Mississippi, and it's about the same amount of people as the children of Israel when they left Egypt. Coincidental? I'm not comparing Mississippi to the original tribes of Israel, but it is an interesting thing to see what groups of people of similar amounts of population were able to accomplish in their day and age. So why can't Mississippi change the world? Is something that I preach here in the state. Look what the same amount of people did to give us the Constitution. Why can't we change the world like they did? Something to think about. But so it's the actual enumeration is to be chosen by the representatives. Now, I don't want to read verbatim everything that they went through here, but you can see the footnotes for yourself. But here is something that's real important, is this number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000. This is why the 3/5 was very important. If you have 3,000 people, $30,000, that would be 30,000 times 10, right? So you would have 10 representatives, if my math is correct. 1 for every 30,000. Is that right? So if you have Oh, excuse me, you would have to have 300,000. If you had 300,000 people in your population, you would have 10 representatives. Okay, I did my math wrong. So, but if you had 100,000, you would only have 3. If you had 11,000, 110,000, that would still only be 3. You would have to get to 120,000 to get 4. Follow me? So each state shall have at least one representative for every 30,000 people. So the state New Hampshire is to choose 3. So New Hampshire had a minimum of 90,000 people in that state with these qualifications here. They had Indians there that were not taxed. They weren't considered in the enumeration for one reason. They didn't vote because they were part of their individual tribe, and their tribe couldn't, if they wanted to be an American citizen outside of the tribe, then they would be taxed and could vote. If they wanted to stay within their tribe, they weren't taxed and they couldn't vote. So they're not counted in the census for representatives in the state, in the United States House of Representatives. Massachusetts had 8. So Massachusetts would have to have a minimum of 240,000 inhabitants in the state that fit this criteria. Rhode Island and Providence Plantations only got 1. Why? Because they had less than 60,000 inhabitants in the whole state. Even today, Rhode Island is really, really tiny in landmass, but it's got a lot of people, so it has more than 1 representative. The state of Montana is massive, but I think they only have 1 representative. I know for sure Wyoming only has 1 representative, and a few other states, North and South Dakota, I believe, only have 1 representative. And then, and in Connecticut, 5, New York, 6. So Massachusetts had bigger population than the state of New York. New Jersey only had 4. Pennsylvania had 8, same as Massachusetts. Delaware 1, Maryland 6, Virginia 10. Okay, then you have North Carolina with 5, South Carolina with 5, and Georgia with 3. Now, if you understand about, especially South Carolina and Georgia, these 2 states were the ones that were adamantly opposed to freeing the slaves at the time of the ratifying of the Constitution. South Carolina's population was almost 50-50 slave versus free. Georgia, some sources say that there was even bigger margin there, but it was still close to the 50-50 mark. It was better than 60. It was real close. North Carolina was in the same situation, but not quite as bad. And Virginia had a lot of slaves. They had a ton of slaves, but they weren't to the 50% margin. But if you look at it, Massachusetts' slave population was negligible. They had some. The majority of their slaves during the Revolution were owned by the Tories, the people that were loyal to the British Crown. After the war, they had to flee the state. They had to leave the country, so they took their slaves with them. So in Massachusetts, we can honestly say that they had 240,000 free men that were able to vote. So if you combine South Carolina and Georgia, with 8 representatives. The people that can actually vote there, since their population is almost 50-50, black and white, or slave and free, I should say, then, and it says it down here in the rest of the thing, that South Carolina's free people, their vote carried more weight than the vote of someone in Massachusetts. Because the people that owned the slaves had a higher percentage of vote to make sure that they could keep those slaves under the Constitution. The main problem here was what are we going to do with slavery? Now, they're not addressing that issue here. They're talking about representation in the government. And we're going to cover that in another thing. But when it comes to people in the government having a vote in the future under the Constitution of what to do with the slave issue, now the free voters in South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina, they had an additional 3/5 of the people. So with that being a 3/5 clause, and here I'm doing the math in my head, I'm saying that every 50,000 slaves would have a representative in the U.S. Congress, and yet they didn't have the right to choose that representative or have a representative that would vote in their favor. See that? So why they allowed it, we're not going to get into in a whole lot of detail today. But those are things that aren't being brought up today. And it's very important that we know and we understand these things. So if you were to take the 3/5 out of the equation for the slaveholding states, because these guys were similar to the Indians not taxed because they didn't get to vote. Slaves didn't get to vote, so the North was arguing, why do they get representation if they can't vote? So, and that kind of leads back to what this gentleman, Darius Spearman, was talking about, was how the Constitution itself allowed or set the stage for the Civil War. And we'll get into that in another one. So anyway, hopefully I illuminated some of this for you, but I'm going to go down and read this as quickly as I possibly can. The first appointment thus made, being of a temporary and fugacious character, requires no commentary. The basis assumed was probably very nearly the same, which the Constitution pointed out for all future apportionments, or at least of all free persons in the states. It is obvious that the question how the apportionment should be made was one upon which considerable diversity of judgment might and probably would exist. 3 leading principles of apportionment would at once present themselves. One was to adopt the rule already existing under the Confederation. That is an equality of representation and vote by each state, thus giving each state a right to send not less than 2 nor more than 7 representatives. And in the determination of questions, each state to have 1 vote. This would naturally receive encouragement from all of those who were attached to the Confederation and preferred a mere league of states to a government in any degree national. the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And accordingly, it formed, as it should seem, the basis of what was called the New Jersey Plan. This rule of apportionment met, however, with a decided opposition, was negative in the convention at an early period, 7 states voting against it, 3 being in its favor, and 1 being divided. It was the 3 southern states were the ones, or the 4 southern states were the ones that were opposed to it, or in favor of it. Another, and especially the little states like Rhode Island, they didn't want the big states to walk all over them, and they wanted everything the same. Another principle might be to apportion the representatives of states according to the relative property of each property, thus making property the basis of representation. This might commend itself to some persons because it would introduce a salutary check into the legislature in regard to taxation by securing in some measure an equalization of the public burdens by the voice of those who were called to give the most towards the common contributions. That taxation ought to go hand in hand with representation had been a favorite theory of the American people. Under the Confederation, all the common expenses were required to be borne by the states in proportion to the value of the land within each state. But as it had been already seen, that this mode of contribution was extremely difficult and embarrassing and unsatisfactory in practice under the Confederation. There, no doubt, indeed, seem to be any traces in the proceedings of the convention that this scheme had an exclusive influence with any persons in that body. It mixed itself up with other considerations without acquiring any decisive preponderance. In the first place, it was easy to provide a remedial check upon undue direct taxation, the other species of which there could be the slightest danger of unequal and oppressive levies. And it was seen that this was sufficiently provided for by declaring that representatives and direct taxes should be apportioned by the same ratio. In the next place, although property may not be directly aimed at as the basis in the representation provided for by the Constitution, it cannot, on the other hand be deemed totally excluded, as will presently be seen. In the next place, it is not admitted that property alone can, in a free government, safely be relied on as the sole basis of representation. It may be true, and probably is, that in the ordinary course of affairs, it is not the interest or policy of those who possess property to oppress those who want it. But in every well-ordered commonwealth, persons as well as property should possess a just share of influence. The liberties of the people are too dear and too sacred to be entrusted to any persons who may at all times have a common sympathy and common interest with the people in the preservation of their public rights, privileges, and liberties. Checks and balances, if not indispensable to, are at least a great conservative in the operations of all free governments. And perhaps upon mere abstract theory, it cannot be justly affirmed that either persons or property, numbers or wealth, can safely be trusted as the final repository of the delegated powers of government. By apportioning influence among each, vigilance, caution, and mutual checks are naturally introduced and perpetuated. The third and remaining principle was to apportion the representatives among the states according to their relative numbers. This had the recommendation of great simplicity and uniformity in its operations, of being generally acceptable to the people, and being less liable to fraud and evasion than any other which could be devised. Besides, although wealth and property cannot be affirmed to be in different states, exactly in proportion to the numbers, they are not so widely separated from it as at a hasty glance might be imagined. There is, if not a natural, at least a very common connection between them. And perhaps an apportionment of taxes according to numbers is as equitable a rule for contributions according to relative wealth as any which can be practically obtained. The scheme, therefore, under all circumstances of making numbers the basis of the representation of the Union seems to have obtained a more general favor than any other in the convention, because it had a natural and universal connection with the rights and liberties of the whole people. But here a difficulty of a very serious nature arose. There were other persons in several of the states than those who were free. There were some persons who were bound to service for a term of years, though these were so few that they could scarcely vary the result of the general rule in any important degree. There were Indians also in several and probably in most of the states at that period who were not treated as citizens, and yet who did not form a part of independent community or tribes, exercising general sovereignty and powers of government within the boundaries of the state. That's what I was talking about, the Choctaw tribe here in Mississippi. But some of them were part of the tribe and some of them weren't. What do you do with them? You don't see the Indians in an uproar. It was necessary, therefore, to provide for these cases, though they were attended with no practical difficulty. Look at that. They were attended with no practical difficulty. There seems not to have been any objection in including in the ratio representation persons bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed. The real, and it was very exciting, controversy was in regard to slaves, whether they should be included in the enumeration or not. So they did use the term slaves when they were talking about this in their deliberations. They just wanted to be polite and say 3/5 of the people that were bound, or whatever the term was. On the one hand, it was contended that slaves were treated in the states which tolerated slavery as property and not as persons. The slaveholding states of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were considered property. They were bought and sold, devised and transferred like any other property. They had no civil rights or political privileges. They had no will of their own, but were bound to absolute obedience to their masters. There was then no more reason for including them in the census of persons than there would be for including any brute animals whatsoever. The North was arguing here at this point, saying, look, if you want your property, is what you claim with your slaves in the representation, then we get to include our horses and cattle, because it's our property that we can dispose of and sell and do what we want with. That's what they were using. Because you can't consider them a person or property at the same time. Here's the conundrum. There was then no more reason for including them in the census of persons than there would be for including any brute animals whatsoever, horses, cows, sheep. If they were to be represented as property, the rule should be extended so as to embrace all other property. It would be a gross inequality to allow representation for slaves to the southern states, for that, in effect, would be to allow their masters a predominant right founded on mere property. Look at that, a predominant right founded on property. Thus, 5,000 free persons in a slave state might possess the same power to choose a representative as 30,000 free persons in a non-slaveholding state. See the problem here? How are you going to resolve it? It was a very real, very important thing, but they break it down by the math, which I was just showing you before. Thus, 5,000 free persons in a slave state would possess the same power to choose a representative as 30,000 free persons in a non-slaveholding states. That is 6 times more power in choosing representatives than a free state. Think about that. Think about that. They did. On the other hand, it was contended that slaves are deemed persons as well as property. They partake of the qualities of both. In being compelled to labor, not for himself, but for his master, in being vendible by one master to another, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with the irrational animals, which fall under the denomination of property. But in being protected in his life and limbs against the violence of others, even of the master of his labor and liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by law as a member of the society, and not as part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, and not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution should therefore view them in a mixed character of persons and property, which was in fact their true character. It is true that slaves are not included in the estimate of reputation in any of the states possessing them. They neither vote themselves nor increase the vote of their masters. This is in the state representations, in the states. In Georgia, the slaves didn't have a chance to vote. They weren't counted in the census for the representatives in the state legislature. They neither vote themselves nor increase the votes of their masters. They're talking about increasing the votes of their masters here. So how do you resolve it? The federal Constitution should therefore view them in the mixed character of persons and property, which is in fact their true character. But it is also true that the Constitution itself does not proceed upon any ratio of merely qualified voters, either as to representation or as to electors of them. Meaning the women and children were included in the census. If therefore those who are not voters are to be excluded from the enumeration or census, a similar inequality will exist in the apportionment among states. For the representatives are not to be chosen by those, for the representatives are to be chosen by those who are qualified voters for the most numerous branch of the state legislature, and the qualifications in different states are essentially different, and indeed are in no two states exactly alike. The Constitution itself, therefore, lays down a principle that which requires that no regard shall be had to the policy of particular states toward their own inhabitants. Why should not the same principle apply to slaves as to other persons who are excluded as voters in the state? See here, this is what the northern states were arguing about. Why do you include them in the representation for the federal legislature if they're not included in the state legislature? For some part of this reasoning may not be very satisfactory, especially the latter part of it. The distinction between a free person who is not a voter, but who is, in no sense, property, and a slave who is not a voter and who is, in every practical sense, property, is and forever must form a sound ground for discriminating between them in every constitutional government. It was added that the idea was not entirely a just one, that representation relates to persons only and not to property. Government is instituted no less for the protection of the property than of the persons of the individuals. The one as well as the other may therefore be considered as proper to be represented by those who are charged with the government. And in point of fact, this view of the subject constituted the basis of some of the representative departments in several of the state governments. There was another reason urged why the voters allowed in the federal legislature to the people of each state to bear some proportion to the comparative wealth of the states. It was that states have not an influence over other states, arising from the superior advantages of fortune, and individuals in the same state possess over their needy fellow citizens the like cause. The richest state in the Union can hardly indulge the hope of influencing the choice of a single representative in another state. Nor will the representatives of the largest and richest states possess any other advantages in the national legislature than that what results from superior numbers alone. Meaning California can't affect the vote in Mississippi. That's up to debate today, but that's what it means. A Louisiana registered citizen cannot vote in a Mississippi election legally. It is obvious that these latter reasons have no just application to the subject. He's just going back and forth between what they're arguing, both sides of the spectrum, property or population. How do we apportion the people? What do we do with the slaves that can't vote? Are they considered property? Are they considered people? Or are they considered both? If they're both, then how do we figure it out? It is obvious that these latter reasons have no just application on the subject. They are not only overstrained and founded in an ingenuous attempt to gloss over the real objections. This is what I want modern people to understand right here. You can't put your overstrained and ingenuous attempts to gloss over the real objections. They're picking one side of the story and not the other side of the story. The Bible is very, very specific that a wise man will consider both sides of the story before he makes a decision. Because if you only hear one side of the story, that seems the most logical until you hear the other side of the story. And then, but see, that's what people are doing today, and they're doing it on purpose. It is obvious that these latter reasons have no just application to the subject. They are not only overstrained and founded in an ingenuous attempt to gloss over the real objections, but they have this inherent vice that, if well-rounded, they apply with equal force to the representation of all property in all the states. And if not entitled to respect on this account, they contain a most gross and indefensible inequality in favor of a single species of property, i.e. slaves, existing in a few states only. It might have been contended with full as much propriety that rice or cotton or tobacco or potatoes should have been exclusively taken into account in apportioning the representation. If you're going to consider property for representation, then so you got to consider rice, tobacco, and cotton or potatoes. So people are complaining today, well, he's only considered as 3/5 of a man. Well, would you rather him be considered as a potato? The truth is, we're almost done here. 2 more sections. The truth is that the arrangement adopted by the Constitution was a matter of compromise and concession, confessedly unequal in its operation, but a necessary sacrifice to that spirit of conciliation, which was indispensable to the union of states having a great diversity of interest in physical condition and political institutions. Now, this is what I want you to see here that is very, very important. And nobody, I mean nobody in this country that I have seen, and I pay attention to a lot. I've never heard any politician, any judge, any pundit, any talking head on podcasts or the TV, any college professor, any PhD in political science quote what I'm about to read you right here from the mouth of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. It was agreed that slaves should be represented under the mild appellation of other persons, not as free persons, but only in a proportion of 3/5. The clause was in substance borrowed from the resolve passed by the Continental Congress on the 18th of April, 1783, recommending the states to amend the Articles of Confederation in such manner that the national expenses should be defrayed out of a common treasury. This is after they had won the war. I'm not sure if it's when the treaty was signed or not, but the war was over. They're trying to figure out how to pay the debt of the war. How are they going to apportion to the different states how much that they have to contribute to pay off the debt of the war that they all mutually fought and benefited from? This clause was in substance borrowed from the resolve passed by the Continental Congress on the 18th of April, 1783, recommending to the states to amend the Articles of Confederation in such manner that the national expenses should be defrayed out of common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the whole number of white or other free inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description, except Indians not paying taxes in each state. So it's almost word for word what the states had agreed upon in 1783 for the apportionment of taxes. the southern states, whose population was 50% not free, would have bankrupted the southern states. So they made a compromise to say, well, we'll only count them for 2/3. In order to reconcile the non-slave holding states to this provision, another clause was inserted that direct taxes should be apportioned in the same manner as representatives, so that theoretically representation and taxation might go hand in hand. Pari passu, side by side or hand in hand on an equal footing. Isn't that genius? This provision, however, is more specious than any solid for a while in the levy of direct taxes. It apportions them as 3/5 of persons not free. It, on the other hand, really exempts the other 2/5 from being taxed at all as property. So, I mean, what's fair about that? If I'm a person and I get taxed 100% of whatever my allotment is, why should this other human being over here only be taxed for 60%? He gets 40% discount. What's fair in that? You see what they're dealing with here? You tell me a better way to figure it out. Whereas if direct taxes had been apportioned as upon principles they ought to be, according to the real value of property within the state, the whole of the slaves would have been taxable as property. So they had already figured this out a long time before the constitutional debates. But as far more striking inequality has been disclosed by the practical operations of the government, the principle of representation is constant and uniform. The levy of direct taxes is occasional and rare. In the course of 40 years, no more than 3 direct taxes have ever been levied. Taxing the people. They didn't do it. And those under very extraordinary and pressing circumstances. The ordinary expenditures of the government are and always have been derived from other sources. Other sources than what? Directly taxing the citizens. Imports among foreign importations have supplied and will generally supply all the common wants. And if these should not furnish an adequate revenue, excises are next resorted to as the surest and most convenient mode of taxation. Direct taxes constitute the last resort, and as might have been foreseen, would never be laid until other resources failed. It's another thing. Viewed in its proper light as a real compromise in a case of conflicting interests for the common good, the provision is entitled to great praise for its moderation, its aim at practical utility, and its tendency to satisfy the people that the union framed by all ought to be dear to all, by the privileges it confirms as well as the blessings it secures. It had a material influence in reconciling the southern states to other provisions in the Constitution, and especially to the power of making commercial regulations by mere majority, which was thought peculiar to favor the northern states. We're going to get this other provisions in another segment. It has sometimes been complained of as a grievance, but he who wishes well to his country will adhere steadily to it as a fundamental policy which extinguishes some of the most mischievous sources of all political divisions, those founded on geographical position and domestic institutions. It did not, however, pass the convention without objection. Upon its first introduction, it was supported by the votes of 9 states against 2. In subsequent stages of the discussion, it was met with some opposition, and in some state conventions, it was strenuously resisted. The 2 states that voted against this were Georgia and South Carolina. They wanted them to be 100%. The wish of every patriot ought now to be requiescant in pace, in pace. Recognize the letters there, RIP? That's Latin for rest in peace. Let it die, folks. Let it rest in peace. These guys did the best they could with what they had to try to solve a very magnanimous situation. The one thing that modern Americans do not understand that we'll cover in some subsequent issues here is the fact that these people were British subjects prior to July the 4th of 1776. They had the rights that were granted to them by the king, and the king had veto power over all their legislation. Slavery was a British institution that the Americans of 1776 inherited and took head on when they debated the Constitution. We'll get into more of this as we go. But for now, you people that don't understand the 3/5 compromise here, you need to let it rest in peace. God bless. I know this is a long one, but it's very important. Very, very important. Share this with everybody that you possibly can. Make this sucker go viral, and let's actually change something in America. Show the people where they're wrong and just say, look, guys, these guys did the best they could. Let it rest in peace. Amen.